Good evening. I am Deidre McPherson, Department Director of Public Programs here at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this exciting event, part of the Cleveland Foundation's third annual Cleveland Book Week. We are thrilled to host this conversation between Steven Pinker and Henry Louis Gates Jr., and to be part of the Anisfield-Wolf experience during such a special week. The Cleveland Museum of Art has a long-standing and vibrant history of partnership with the Cleveland Foundation. The latest in that partnership is our Curatorial Arts Mastery Program, part of a larger diversity leadership initiative at the museum and beyond to nurture and develop diverse talent in the museum profession. We're excited to be part of the Cleveland Foundation's Arts Mastery investments, where young people from Cleveland neighborhoods are mastering art forms from a variety of disciplines through rigorous, high-quality instruction, now including the curatorial arts. Anisfield-Wolf has already helped strengthen this work and our exploration of how the literary and visual arts collide. For example, Taya Hemba Jess, winner of the 2017 Anisfield-Wolf Book Award in Poetry, worked with the museum to enrich our Diversifying Art Museum Leadership Initiative last fall, and a mural inspired by his award-winning book, Olio, now graces the Case Western Reserve University campus just around the corner from here. The Cleveland Museum of Art thanks you for joining us tonight as a continuation of our partnership with the Cleveland Foundation and the Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards. It is now my pleasure to welcome my friend Karen Long, Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards Manager for the Cleveland Foundation.
Thank you, Deidre. Welcome, everyone. It is an honor and a delight to be with you this evening. We have a unique program. Dr. Steven Pinker and Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. in conversation on Professor Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now. In January, fanboy Bill Gates called it, quote, "my new favorite book ever," unquote. That's the headline Gates wrote for his column about this book. Well, there are also sterner critiques out there. Here to unpack some of that are two public intellectuals, the author himself, a cognitive psychologist at Harvard University, and his friend and fellow Harvard scholar, Skip Gates, who runs the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. In introducing them, I will not fritter your time reading out the accolades and accomplishments you can bring up on your phones. Instead, I'll mention what I've observed watching them as jurists for the Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards. And I'm just going to make a little aside here to say this is so delectable that 3 of our winners are in the house. We have our Lifetime Achievement winner, Scott Momaday, our poetry winner, Shane McRae, and our fiction winner, Jessamine Ward. And before I segue back, I just need to let you know there's another eminence with us, an Ohio eminence, the great jurist, Rita Dove. So Dr. Gates invited Dr. Pinker onto the jury following the untimely death of Stephen Jay Gould in 2002. Skip Gates knows the value of having a scientist on the panel. And you, if you've read The Better Angels of Our Nature or Enlightenment Now, know this is a writer who cleaves to facts. In the new book, Dr. Pinker uses them to marshal an argument that science, reason, and humanism have put us on an enormous global upswing in wealth, health, literacy, on-the-job safety, and numerous other indicators. Professor Pinker is not one to hold with conventional thinking. Instead, he holds with evidence. He argues with graphs. He has been known to boot a book from Anisfield-Wolf consideration because a footnote is sloppy. And he is clearly fond of a good footnote. Sometimes Drs. Pinker and Gates disagree about the merits of a book for months. This isn't surprising. One is from Montreal, the other is from West Virginia. So let me be honest. When I think of them, a lick from Hamilton keeps popping into my mind. Why do you assume you're the smartest in the room? Why do you assume you're the smartest in the room? Well, like our nation's founders, they often are, especially when they are in a room with Rita Dove or our other two jurors, Joyce Carol Oates and Simon Schema. And like the founders, these five know how to disagree in a way that makes the work stronger. I do hope we will see a bit of that tonight. And so I give you the illustrious Dr. Steven Pinker and Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Give it up for Karen Long, ladies and gentlemen. Yes. Dr. Pinker, how much did you pay Bill Gates for this in blurb, man? He's the greatest blurb of all time. My new favorite book of all time, Bill Gates. By the way, the Harvard Crimson calls him the other Gates. I like it.
Whatever, I couldn't afford it.
No, you couldn't afford it. All right, Stephen, why the Enlightenment and why now?
So I use the Enlightenment as a rubric or a label for the four ideals that I enumerate in the subtitle. Reason, science, humanism, and progress. I defend each one. I could have used other terms for this complex of ideas, cosmopolitan liberalism or secular humanism or the open society, but the Enlightenment values seem to be a term that a lot of people resonated to. And now, because I argue we need them more than ever, that we now know that the project of the Enlightenment, which is that if we use reason to figure out how the world works, if we apply reason to the physical world through science, if we set as our goal human well-being as opposed to the glory of the nation or the tribe or the race or the faith or the class, then we can make progress. We can't achieve utopia. The progress is not linear, but things can get better. I argue with graphs and facts that now we can say that the Enlightenment worked, it is working, and more than ever, I suggest it needs a defense. There are alternatives to Enlightenment thinking. There is religious fundamentalism, there is reactionary thinking, there is hard left and hard right ideologies. But the idea that we should just make people better off using knowledge doesn't have enough defenders, I suggest. It's faded into the background as kind of the status quo or the default. Whereas other ideologies, like militant nationalism and reactionary thinking, people are willing to get up and pound the table for them. I thought that we need that kind of thing for Enlightenment values.
So you were trying to cheer us up, trying to give us hope, trying to bolster us? Yeah.
Egg us on. And in particular, the data that I show that despite the impression of the world that you get from reading the daily headlines, which admittedly are mighty depressing, progress is real. We have made progress. We live longer. And by we, I mean humanity across the globe. This is not a a Western phenomenon. But people everywhere are living longer. There are fewer poor people worldwide, fewer illiterate children, fewer hungry people, fewer diseased people, people work fewer hours, people are safer, fewer people are killed in war.
And you make a big deal out of pointing to access to sanitation. More flush.
Access to sanitation is not a romantic, sexy cause, but a vitally important one.
But very important. Waterless toilets as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, sewage-borne pathogens kill people, a lot of people.
Yeah.
More people than terrorists by a large margin. Mm-hmm. We read a lot about terrorism. We don't read enough about flush toilets. But now more than another reason for now is that if we take these accomplishments for granted, the fact that life expectancy worldwide has risen from 30 to 70, that extreme poverty has declined from 90% of the world's population to 10% of the world's population, then we can be open to radicals and demagogues who point to problems that we continue to have, and of course we continue to have problems. Problems are inevitable, and convey the impression that we're living in an era of such carnage, to use a salient word, that our institutions are failing so badly that we may as well just destroy them all, because anything that rises out of the rubble is bound to be better than what we have. Drain the swamp. Only I can fix it. That can be appealing if you think that really society is circling the drain. To be reminded of the fact that things could be a lot worse, things used to be a lot worse, makes us appreciate, I argue in the book, institutions like liberal democracy, like international organizations, like a free press, that deserve credit for this progress, that were themselves brainchildren of the Enlightenment, and that it's dangerous to take them for granted.
You argue, it's very curious though, you argue that people tend to think things are worse than they really are. I was fascinated by that. Why do you think that's true?
Yeah, so a curious phenomenon is that if you ask people about their lives, this is a phenomenon well known to psychologists. People are irrationally rosy about their own lives. Yes, how likely is it that you'll be a victim of a car accident or a divorce or cancer? And everyone thinks they're above average, the so-called Lake Woebegone effect. But if you switch, people think they're lucky, and that's meaningless. It's mathematically impossible for someone to be lucky, a lucky person. Lucky just means that you just have managed to have escaped various disasters, but it's not a trait of yourself. So people are irrationally optimistic when it comes to themselves. But if you switch the question, you don't ask them about themselves, but you ask them about their society, then, as I put it, they switch from Pollyanna to Eeyore. Now people are irrationally pessimistic. They overestimate. You ask them, how's your kids' school? Oh, it's pretty good. I think they're learning a lot. How are the nation's schools? Oh, they're failing. They're terrible. Kids aren't learning anything.
You call that the optimism gap, right?
The optimism gap. Yeah. I didn't coin the term, but yeah, I think that's a label for it.
So why? Where does this come from?
Well, I think it comes, although I'm reluctant to join in all the criticism of the media, the mainstream media, because it's certainly better than the alternatives to the mainstream media. But I think there are some distorters that are built into the nature of journalism. And it has to be journalism that gives people their view of the country as a whole, because none of us travels to all 50 states. What we know is what we read. And we know that I think there's a chemistry between the way the human mind assesses risk and danger and probability in general, namely through images and anecdotes and stories. Psychologists call it the availability heuristic. If you ask someone how common something is, they just try to remember some examples. The faster the examples come to mind, the more common they think it is. So people, if you ask people what kills more people in a given year, tornadoes or asthma attacks? People will say tornadoes.
Right.
The answer is asthma attacks kill at least 80 times more people than tornadoes.
Yeah, but you don't see them on CNN.
They don't see them on CNN. Tornadoes make great television. Asthma attacks, not so much. So if you combine that with the nature of the news, namely news reports stuff that happens, not stuff that doesn't happen. So you never see journalist saying, I'm reporting live from a country that's at peace, or a city that has not been shot up by terrorists. And the fact that because news covers events, not trends, things that creep up on you a few percentage points a year just never make the news. But I like to quote Max Roser, a young economist. He says that the papers could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never carried that headline. And the result is 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. In fact, if you ask people, has extreme poverty gotten better, gotten worse, stayed the same? A majority of people say stayed the same or gotten worse. And the answer is it's gotten way better, like absolutely plummeted. So people's understanding of the world is systematically distorted by the particular events they read about. And so I think the nature of journalism plays a role.
So what would you do if you could change the nature of journalism? I mean, would you have a good news column? Or, now we're going to report the good news? This is a problem black people have argued about for a long time, that you don't see positive role models, right?
Exactly,
That you just see black people either being arrested or being victimized, but you don't see the upper middle class in dramas and in roles sufficient. It's a long argument about image projection and civil rights, the future of the Harlem Renaissance was all about that in a way. So what would you do?
I think that's
if you're running CNN, you need eyeballs, as it were, right? And people like tragedies.
They do. I mean, we like mayhem and murder in our art, and tragedies and murder mysteries and James Bond films and so on. And so we do like it in our news too.
Right. And we like it, the fact that it's not us.
It's especially. No, that is so true.
Right.
Conversely,
it's like Schadenfreude, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Conversely, terrorists and rampage shooters kind of game the system. They jerk the media around by creating a relatively small amount of violence where it could be us. So we think when we see it, and so we're riveted. And the tendency of journalism to give saturation coverage to acts of violence creates an opening for these violence entrepreneurs, which then in turn make the country terrified far out of proportion to the actual risk. I can say with very high confidence, none of you are going to die in a terrorist attack. Just it kills too few people, 6 people a year. The tens of thousands of people die in car crashes and falling off ladders and using hair dryers near bathtubs, to say nothing of diseases, many of them much more preventable than we think. But how should journalism deal with the state of the world more responsibly? So I think some of it should be to be more data-oriented when covering a terrorist attack, to remind people of how many people are killed by terrorists compared to other causes of death, to use more graphs and data and more history. And by history, I don't mean going back necessarily to 250 years to before there were flush toilets and anesthesia, but even 25 years ago, 30 years ago, to place stories in a little bit of historical context, and to cover some of the slow developments, some of the positive developments, such as the African-American upper middle class that are otherwise invisible, and indeed people's beliefs about African Americans are statistically out to lunch because of the coverage that crimes and drug busts and other kinds of pathology get, as opposed to the not so newsworthy but much more real lives of
Well, let's talk about that as a specific example. And the facts are, basically since the day Dr. King was killed, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but 1970, black middle class doubled, upper middle class quadrupled. That's good news. But as you know from your exchange with Homi Bhabha, because he quoted me, the percentage of black children living at or beneath the poverty line has gone from 40% to 30%. So it's still just under 1 out of 3 black kids is born in poverty. People like black people in this room are in the doubled middle class or upper middle class. But I feel like there hasn't been enough progress made for our people. If Dr. King came back and he said, Stephen, how have my people done? And you said, well, the good news, Doc, is that the upper middle class quadrupled. King would have thought that the percentage of black children in poverty would have gone down proportionally. You know, it's not rational, but that's how people think. If somehow the black upper middle class have quadrupled, shouldn't the percentage of black people in poverty be reduced by 3/4, as it were? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So how am I supposed to feel about that? And I made a film about this for PBS, which is I, on the one hand, celebrate all the triumphs that our generation enjoys, right? And and praise that progress. But on the other hand, it said that 1 out of 3 black kids is living in poverty. So progress or not progress? How do we account for the complexities of that picture?
Yeah. So I don't think it's that complex, although it underscores the fact that progress is not perfection. It's things can be at the same time bad, but much better than they used to be. They were even worse. In the case of poverty, it's interesting when I saw that fact that Homie attributed to you, it worried me because I also talked about reduction of African American poverty in the book, and I just want to make sure our numbers lined up. The one that I cited was, which is statistically compatible with that, is from 1960 to the present, the poverty rate among African Americans across the board went from about 50% to 25%. So, and those are compatible. I started about 10 years earlier, and I included all African Americans.
Sure, and I only looked at children.
Yeah, and you looked at children.
Right.
So the fact that the poverty rate is cut in half is not good enough. We want to eliminate it to as close to 0 as possible. But and I'm sensitive to the possible criticism that, and one that I think is part of the culture of journalism, that if you do report on what goes right, then you'll lull people into complacency. They'll think, oh, it happened by itself, there's nothing that we need to do, and everything is great. Now, everything could be bad, but things could have been worse in the past, and that is what happened. And I actually think that it's better to be aware of the progress together with the unsolved problems, because even though there could be a danger of complacency if we fail to recognize the problems that remain, there could be a problem of fatalism if we don't think there's been improvement. So all of these years, the Great Society, the War on Poverty, the Civil Rights Act, if it's made no difference, if things are as bad as they were before, then why did we bother, and why should we even work toward bringing the poverty rate still further? And in fact, it is an article of faith on in large parts of the American right that the war on poverty was such a failure that we should cut back on the social safety net, on government programs, because they're just throwing money down a rat hole. The fact that the reality is that a lot of the government anti-poverty programs were highly successful, such as the reduction of the overall black poverty rate from 50% to 25%, and across the entire country, when you factor in the income after taxes and transfers, including things like earned income tax credit and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and so on, the poverty rate across the country has fallen from about 30% to about 7%. Since 1960.
Since 60, okay.
Yeah.
Say that again, from 30% to
7%.
7%.
And our
and 25% for black people.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Now, of course, there are different poverty lines defined in different ways. And our colleague, Sandy Jenks, Christopher Jenks, has made the argument that if you do the calculations right, you see that obviously not every government program has succeeded. Some of them were boondoggles. But on the whole, there has been progress, which doesn't mean we should be complacent. Quite the contrary. It means we should try to identify what has worked, and something has worked, and make sure we do more of that.
You've identified, we'll come back to that. You've identified as signal Enlightenment values the following. The following characteristics of a society, right, that's enlightened. Politically centrist, a society with a liberal democratic government, one which has an economy based on free market capitalism, one that minimizes or ignores religion, and one that emphasizes the power and science of science and technology. Why? What's so magical about these particular things and them in combination? Because there are a lot of people out here, you know, I'm from the African American community. There are 18 million black Baptists that are going to kick your butt about that religion.
Right.
Won't you talk about my Jesus?
Yeah. So we'll go through. We'll go through those separately. So market economies have shown themselves to be the most effective way of generating prosperity. And if you're skeptical, just answer the question: would you rather live in South Korea or North Korea? Holding culture constant, holding geography constant, holding resources constant. Would you rather have lived in East Germany or West Germany? Chile or Venezuela? Now, one of the reasons it's so hard to have this discussion is people autocorrect capitalism to untrammeled, unfettered, unregulated capitalism.
The good old-fashioned laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah, and extreme anarcho-capitalism.
I'm being ironic, in case. Yeah.
And
or more like China. But our image of capitalism in China,
post-Mao.
Yeah.
Of course, China is authoritarian capitalism.
Yeah, right. But it's complicated. But
so when I extol markets, I mean regulated markets with a robust safety net, and they are not incompatible. An irony that few people are aware of is that the countries that rate highest on economic freedom by these libertarian organizations that rank countries are also the countries that have the strongest social safety nets, like Denmark, like New Zealand.
Oh, right.
Easy to start a business there, So yes, markets with regulation and social spending have not, now there are reasons a priori to think that they ought to work, and Adam Smith during the Enlightenment and David Ricardo identified them. But still, if you have a scientific mindset about society, and by that I don't mean rigid formulas, experts doing precise calculations, but rather what really makes science is falsifiability. If you were to shake a scientist awake in the middle of the night and say, what distinguishes science from pseudoscience or non-science, they would say falsifiability. Sir Karl Popper's criterion for what makes something scientific. That is, you have to be humble, let the world tell you whether you're right or wrong, and if you're wrong, you should allow the world to tell you that. And we have seen from history, from current comparisons, that countries with free markets, again, free markets with regulation and social spending, are happier and healthier and more peaceful and richer. And so history has kind of vindicated that Enlightenment ideal. For political centrism, I think countries that lurch far to the right or far to the left tend to bring suffering and poverty to their people, not because Goldilocks is always right and the truth is always halfway in between two extremes. I mean but rather because if a society is functioning okay, if people are well fed, if the crime rate is low, if the country's not at war, if more people are trying to immigrate in than emigrate out, it suggests that it's probably weeded out some of the worst blunders of the past, and that the center is almost by definition what you get when you don't try a lot of things that were really disastrous in the past on the left and right extremes. So for religion, I distinguish between religious institutions and theological beliefs. Religious institutions can do a lot of good if they are affected by the Enlightenment and humanistic currents, if they don't preach that homosexuality is a sin, or that women ought to be commanded by their husbands, that kids who talk back to their parents should be executed, that adulteresses should be stoned. If you kind of
gay people will burn in hell.
Burn in hell. Right. And in fact, many religions have allegorized, spin-doctored, adopted a kind of benign hypocrisy. Well, yeah, that's in the scripture, but it's really just kind of metaphorical. We don't take it too seriously. Then, and that, I think, is under the influence of the Enlightenment that prioritizes, as a source of morality, human well-being rather than scripture.
Stephen, that's under the influence of economics. You need new parishioners. You need new people coming in. But Bishop Jones, Grace Jones's brother's a famous bishop in L.A.
Yeah.
And I was talking to him about, I filmed him once. He was a fabulous preacher. He said, Brother Gates, the bottom line is, all I'm concerned about each week is getting more brothers and sisters coming in the front of the church than are on Saturday night going out the back of the church.
Yes, indeed. But that itself shows that people's sensibilities have changed, and they're not going to stand for getting their morality from 2,000-year-old commandments. The people's conception of morality, which I think has been evolving under the influence of Enlightenment values, are that things that make people better off are good, things that hurt people are bad, and homosexuality doesn't make anyone worse off, and so that part of the Bible we're going to pretend doesn't exist. We're going to ignore it. So under that kind of pressure, religions themselves, some of them, not all of them, have changed. The religious institutions are the ritual, the art, the community, the provision in sometimes in places of education and medical care and conflict resolution. So those are all good things as long as the appealing to a deity, using scripture as the source of morality gets sidelined.
But how are we supposed to feel if you're a person of color or a woman in this room, but there are other gay people? We've all, our antecedents, if not us in particular, have suffered under the so-called objectivity of science. And you know, I've made a new series on Reconstruction, the fall of Reconstruction. And as you know, we were talking in the car, I've written a book to go with it. And it's about the brief period of Reconstruction. For those of you who don't know, it was like the maximum period of black freedom, 1865 to 1877, followed by this huge wave of white supremacy. And it manifested itself in different discourses over the rest of the 19th century. But one was scientific discourse. They found, with the sanction of science, ways to explain that black people were either not fully human, well, if they were human, they were subhuman. Well, there's a great chain of being, which was the 18th century concept, but at the top, the Apollonian, like Europeans, at the bottom of the human scale, the African, and what was below the African? The ape, and the Africans were ape-like. And even with IQ tests, there are people who think that black people are just genetically inferior as measured by IQ test. Why should black people go running out and cheering for the objectivity of science when we've suffered so much? Not to mention the Tuskegee, the horrible, heinous Tuskegee syphilis experiment. How can you, what do you have to say about that, Mr. Scientist?
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of things. One of them is it wasn't primarily science that initiated these horrific ideas and developments. A lot of them were rooted in fact, primarily rooted in mythology, in bad mythology, bad history, in the theories of Gobineau, of the Aryans that spilled forth out of a homeland as heroic warriors.
But Harvard was a home of eugenics thought, too. You know, but yes, but keep going.
But this is all, so scientific institutions are not immune from the ideology that pervades the time and place in which they're found. But we now know that in fact, there was scientists who showed that that was bad science, and that it's the better science that developed that allows us to say, that wasn't just evil, that was mistaken, that was wrong. And so even though science as an institution is rarely completely separate from the surrounding context, it's the ethic of science in finding out what's right and what's wrong that is our best corrective for that kind of misinformation.
Well, let's go back to the Enlightenment, the great philosophers of the Enlightenment. You're in love with Kant.
No. In fact, actually, I'm not in love with any of them.
Okay.
Because the idea isn't these were a bunch of great guys and let's go back to the glory days of the Enlightenment. Far from it. It's a lot of them were as individuals were either heinous or did heinous things. It's really the ideas that of reason and science and humanism that are worth celebrating. And in fact, that itself is part and parcel of the Enlightenment, that it's not about a bunch of guys. It's not about the wisdom or virtue of a particular person or clique. All ideas have to come from somewhere, and so we should attribute the ideas from where they actually came. But they got a lot of things wrong, and they were, and a lot of them were not particularly noble people. Jefferson, being a great example, had some great ideas, and in some ways being a heinous human being.
Well, let's talk about Kant just for a second.
Yeah.
And you epigraphist from Kant, you write that.
Spinoza.
Well, no, but I mean the long, beautiful Kant passage that Kant defines. Yes, the Kant.
What is enlightenment? He was
what
the
is
one who gave us
enlightenment?
the term. Yeah.
Right. That's what I mean. It's like the subtext of the book. You write that Kant defines enlightenment, quote, as humankind's emergence from its self-incurred immaturity, its lazy and cowardly submission to the dogmas and formulas of religious or political authority. And Kant also wrote in that same essay, which of course is What is Enlightenment, quote, a man may propose his own enlightenment, but only for a limited period of time. Now, at the same time, though, Kant wrote in 1764, he wrote a book called Observation on the Beautiful and Sublime. And in section 4, he responds to David Hume's of National Character. And in it, he says, he quotes someone on something that a black man supposedly said. And Kant goes on to say, but the man was black from head to toe, a clear sign that what he said was stupid. And it's the first direct conflation of character and characteristics that I, in my work on the Enlightenment, ever found. It's a shocking thing to find. Yet a few years later, he writes a critique of pure reason, right? So my question is this a case of Kant's enlightened theories outweighing his problematic ones? Because as you write, and I quote, if you extol reason, then what matters is the integrity of the thoughts, not the personalities of the thinkers. So Stephen, can we pick and choose this way? How am I, a black man, supposed to read the critique of pure reason without the observation of the beautiful and sublime not echoing in my head?
Yeah.
And I've been wrestling with that since I was a graduate student.
Yeah,
So I've been waiting a long time to ask you this.
Yeah. We must pick and choose, absolutely, because humans are flawed specimens. I'm supposed to quote Kant again, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be built.
Right.
And it's almost importing one of the worst mindsets from religion, that there are prophets and messiahs and seers, and we get wisdom by parsing their texts and assuming that they're right and trying to figure out how they're right. And that's definitely not the idea. We must pick and choose. An equivalent that I went through, starting from when I was an undergraduate, was reading Voltaire and seeing what viciously anti-Semitic things Voltaire wrote. And I do quote things from Voltaire in Enlightenment Now approvingly. And I do that with a clear conscience. Yeah, he lived in the 18th century, and with a combination of the prejudices of the day that people just absorbed from the atmosphere, and the fact that they were victims of a kind of a nature-nurture confound that they couldn't figure out, that the Jews that they encountered did come from insular communities. The African Americans or the Africans, I should say, that they encountered did not have the benefits of an education. And so they were actually fooled by their own experience into attributing essential traits to people who just happened to be victims of a particular upbringing or history. But in any case, we can never assume that someone is just a secular prophet who got everything right. We have to identify the ideas celebrate the ideas that are worth celebrating, and identify the ones that aren't.
Well,
Pardon so much. hate to do this.
Oh, you mean there's an audience here we have to let speak to?
There is a third wall we'd like to break now by inviting your questions, so please join in.
Okay. Please ask questions. I only had 19 more questions to ask.
Paradigm.
How did global warming fit into your paradigm?
Yeah, I have a chapter on climate change. This is an unsolved problem. It's an example where progress in one sphere, namely the capture of energy to deliver prosperity and all of its gifts, has come at the cost of a threat to the environment. I argue that we should treat climate change as a problem to be solved and not an apocalypse in waiting. That if we really think that the planet is cooked and there's nothing that we can do about it, then we may as well just enjoy our gasoline now and let our grandchildren worry about it. But I lay out how I think we ought to approach climate change, which is through a mixture of policy and technology that allows us to enjoy the benefits of energy. And the benefits of energy are inestimable. Many good things come from abundant energy. But to figure out how we can get that without emitting greenhouse gases. This would include a carbon tax so that billions of people will factor the damage they do to the environment by burning carbon into their choices, which products they buy, how they use them, what gets manufactured, and technology. Low and eventually zero and negative carbon energy sources, such as renewables like wind and solar, but I don't think they will be enough to power the entire world 24/7 round the clock. But combined with other zero carbon energy sources, including nuclear, and that would include not only existing technologies, but fourth generation nuclear technologies that will be safer and cheaper and more scalable. Plus, eventually, technologies that take carbon out of the atmosphere, including just planting lots and lots of trees, but carbon capture and storage in conjunction with energy production. So to follow the pathway of what's sometimes called deep decarbonization of the economy.
Hi. Are you comfortable with the idea that capitalism could include a basic standard of living, a basic economic salary, let's say, for families in order that everyone can be at least living in a livable wage, as opposed to some people living with very little money? Let's just say that everyone starts out with the same amount of money and we keep everybody at least that level, and then people can grow from there. Do you think that would be a good way to?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a way to have everyone earn the same thing unless you had a totalitarian government with a salary committee that determined what everyone exactly was going to earn. And attempts to move in that direction have not had pretty results, such as in Maoist China and now in Venezuela. So together with the fact that any government that was powerful enough to determine every last income would have to arrogate to itself the power to restrict the ability of people to start businesses, to set up their sites on Etsy, to engage in entrepreneurial activity. And that's why, with exceptions, but on average, economic freedom and political freedom are more or less correlated. Now, that doesn't mean that capitalist countries ought to be indifferent to the distribution of income. All capitalist countries now have a progressive income tax where people who earn more pay a larger percentage of what they earn, for the obvious reason that a dollar is worth more to a poor person than a rich person. And all capitalist countries have extensive redistribution. Probably we'll need to have more as some of the forces that cause unequal income distribution, such as globalization, such as technology, are going to exaggerate the inequality that we have, and governments will probably have to push back in order to achieve the best outcome across the society as a whole. Probably the United States is a little bit behind that curve, as it is in actually many measures of well-being, but there will, on the other hand, enforcing equal incomes for everyone we know has pernicious effects.
I'm a retired teacher, and I appreciate, Dr. Pinker, your emphasis on looking at facts and how surprising the facts can be when we have a broader view of what's happening in the world. But as a teacher, I've tended to think that the lack of critical thinking in this country is what distresses me most. And I'd just like to ask both of you, how did you become critical thinkers, and is it something that we could do more about in terms of teaching children?
Yes, I do discuss that very issue in the book. And on the one hand, I'm completely agree that critical thinking is the essential skill that education ought to instill. The one problem is that we have not yet figured out how to successfully instill critical thinking. A lot of the critical thinking curricula that exist now, when you test them, that is, when you apply critical thinking to them, namely, do they work? And the answer is often they don't. On the other hand, a lot of educational initiatives, including a lot of college education, doesn't work very well either. And so we have to be clever about how we instill critical thinking. One problem is that the human mind tends to be very sticky and doesn't generalize what it learns in one context to another. So in a critical thinking course, if we say, well, always imagine something from the other side, the other perspective, the other point of view. So imagine the Revolutionary War from the perspective of the British. So the kids will kind of learn how to do that. Then you give them World War I. And it just doesn't occur to them to try to imagine the World War from the perspective of the Central Powers. Knowing how easily critical thinking curricula fail, we can design better ones. And that, of course, is the advantage of reason and critical thinking. Namely, if there is a failure, you can always step back, treat that failure as a problem to be solved, and do better. And in fact, we now know that critical thinking curricula that explicitly get students to generalize from one learning context to another can show positive results. So the answer is, I agree, we must have more critical thinking as long as we apply critical thinking to critical thinking curricula.
But Stephen, how do we, I presume you teach in public schools. How do we instill better vehicles, say, for producing the kind of critical thinking that everyone in this room represents and embodies in a school system that in poor areas, in urban areas, disproportionately affecting people of color, where, you know, the schools are falling apart. I mean, you can't teach, you can't have order. There's so much violence. It's things that you know already.
Yeah, it is there are a number of pathologies of the American educational system, including the fact that they're supported by municipalities, and so poor cities have underfunded education systems. Many other Western democracies have education funded at a national level.
So you would be, so say a public school a student in a public school in Harlem and should be receiving the amount of money spent on a student in the public should be the same as in Palo Alto or Cambridge or Princeton.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Give it up for that, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
That's very important.
Well, in many ways...
You sound like a socialist, Pinker.
Yeah, I'm not a socialist. But in many ways, something that I discovered crunching so many numbers and going through this book is that when people think of Western democracies or capitalist countries, or for that matter, countries that were products of the Enlightenment, as the United States was at its founding. But people tend to think of the United States, and the United States in many ways is a very weird Western democracy. We're really not typical of Western Europe, Canada, New Zealand, that there are a lot of practices in the United States that are not so enlightened, despite the fact that we're the first country that was founded by Enlightenment thinkers on Enlightenment principles.
So what's different about us then?
Well, have a much higher, way higher level of religious belief than any other Western democracy. We have a higher crime rate, violent crime rate, probably 5 times as high as a typical Western European country.
Higher prison incarceration.
Way higher incarceration rate, higher child mortality, higher maternal mortality, lower happiness. Now, the United States is a pretty happy country if you consider all 192 countries. But still, we punch below our wealth in terms of other Western democracies. So there's a lot that's, and probably every measure of human well-being, educational attainment, all of them. The United States, we're in the kind of bottom of the top 10. We're certainly in the top 20. But given that on average, almost all of the good things in life correlate very highly with GDP per capita across countries. So rich countries like Norway also have good human rights. They also are safe. They also have women's equality. So in general, if you plot countries on
safety
curve,
nets.
social safety net. In general, the richer the country, the better everything is. But there's a lot of scatter around that line. So you've got Gulf Arab countries hanging way below the line. They're filthy rich and very backward in terms of a lot of measures of human well-being. And the United States it kind of hangs below that line too. Considering how rich we are, we really ought to do better in measure after measure.
What would make you I'm just curious. I mean, you've been accused by critics of being hyper-optimistic, overly optimistic. What would derail you, Stephen? I mean, what would cause you, what would have to happen for you to say the Enlightenment's over?
Yeah.
And by the way, I have to read this. Karen's going to kill me, but I'm sneaking in another question. He says, in writing the chapters on progress, I resisted pressure from readers of earlier drafts to each one by warning, quote, but all this progress is threatened if Donald Trump becomes president of the United States. No. No, the proper way, he said, if Donald Trump gets his way.
Exactly,
so,
yeah.
Quote, unquote. Do you still explain what you meant by that?
Oh,
and why should we be jumping up and down with the prospect of 2 terms of...
Yeah. Well, if you you just have to actually go to a couple of days ago to the speech that Trump gave at the United Nations, where he said global.
One where people busted out laughing?
That one. Thank goodness. Right. Laughter can often be a force of great progress, as with Voltaire and other wise guys of the day. But yeah, the idea that each country should simply pursue its interests in zero-sum competition with all the others, we kind of tried that, and we got a couple of world wars. And then we kind of figured out, well, let's not do that again. What can we do to prevent World War III? And so we had the United Nations and other organizations of international cooperation, which Trump is now threatening. We had expanded trade, because we know another great Enlightenment idea, the gentle commerce, or du commerce. Countries that trade with each other are less likely to go to war with each other, because you don't kill your customers. And if it's cheaper to buy something than to steal it, you're less tempted to steal it. And Trump, of course, is starting trade wars. Thanks to environmental regulations, we've had both increase in GDP, more miles driven, greater population, while the 5 major air pollutants have gone down by 60%. He wants to weaken the environmental protections. The institutions of democracy, that the leader of a country is not a king who gets to enjoy the spoils, but is hemmed in by the checks and balances of the Constitution, pushing against that. So it isn't just the the typical Massachusetts hostility to any Republican. I lay out.
We have a Republican governor.
Yeah, actually,
But
he's not so bad.
He's a good guy, yeah, but he's really a Democrat. But anyway, go.
But point by point, you can, Donald Trump genuinely, even though, as I mentioned, it sounds like an oxymoron to talk about the intellectual roots of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But he did have advisors like Steve Bannon who consider themselves intellectuals, and Trump is very much a counter-Enlightenment figure, and his advisors would agree that all of the contributions of the Enlightenment, which I argue have deserve credit for the progress that we've enjoyed, are being picked apart by the current administration and by other populist movements in Europe. Now the question is, one of the reasons I did resist the temptation to end every chapter by saying, well, this is all threatened, is we don't know how much he'll get his way. The American system is certainly getting a stress test, and so far it's not pushing back as hard as I would like, but it is pushing back some, and recognizing and being grateful for the gifts of the Enlightenment ought to give us the heft to fight back against these erosions. I also, in my more, I do think that authoritarian populism threatens a lot of this progress, all the more reason to know what the progress has been. If I had to guess whether the Enlightenment is over because the future belongs to Viktor Orban and Donald Trump and so on, I'd say probably.
And the 1%.
And the 1%, yes.
Right.
But probably not, because a lot of the long-term trends in the world as a whole are going to push back against authoritarian populism. One of them is that it's more popular in rural areas and the world is urbanizing. Another is it's more popular among the less educated and levels of education are increasing. And the third is it's more popular among older generational cohorts, and we're going to die and see the stage to millennials who are much less enthusiastic about authoritarian populism. So it's not to deny that there could be a lot of damage in the short term, but over the long term, I don't think that these are all going to be rolled back.
Okay, but quickly, and I think we're being told we have one more. But how do we fight back, Stephen? You who are the embodiment of the defense of the Enlightenment is magnificent, even though, I critique the Enlightenment and its racism. And these guys were brilliant and racist too, and sexist and homophobic, et cetera, et cetera. How do we fight back? How do we fight back? We believe with you in the arc of progress. We want civilization to be better for our children and grandchildren. How do we fight back against these forces that seem to have come out of Middle Earth, man? It's like troglodytes or something coming out. You go it's like a vampire movie. I thought your ass was dead, and then you come back,
Yeah.
How do you scaring the bejesus out? How do we fight back?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that, but here's some suggestions. We do have to address the polarization that is dividing people into tribes, and so people who aren't on the hard right have to not assume that they're infallible about everything and to dismiss the entire right, and therefore just lead them to retreat into their own tent and for it to be a war. I think we've got to remind people of what has gone right and what has made it gone right, that we haven't had World War III. The United Nations isn't such a bad thing for all of its flaws, that environmental regulations actually have helped the environment, even though there's a lot more work to be done, that the war on poverty did have a positive effect, even though there is some poverty that remains, but it used to be much worse. So we can't join in the dystopian vision that just creates an opening for demagogues to say, well, let's drain the swamp, smash the machine, but point out, well, for all the problems that we have, problems are solvable. We've solved problems in the past. We can continue to solve the problems facing us now.
There was a question. One more.
So you spoke towards the beginning of the discussion about having to support the institutions that gave birth to modern prosperity. How confident are you, given like the problems in mass media and the American two-party system, that we can solve the problems within those institutions and not look to alternatives to those systems?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by alternative systems.
Yeah, why don't you want to gloss that for a second? By alternative institutions or systems, what do you mean?
Yeah, so you look at modern mass media, like CNN, for example. How confident are you in those institutions such as CNN? I'm just giving CNN as an example, and not newer media like online media and stuff that's outside of the mass media sphere, I guess.
Can traditional institutions be fixed, or are we going to have to throw them out and reinvent some? Is part of his question.
Well, there's part of the one of the ideals of the Enlightenment is that a society ought to continually experiment. It should not entrench anything in concrete. There's a constant churn of practices within institutions, and sometimes the death of one institution, replacement by something else. It shouldn't be done precipitously, because if for all the problems of CNN, I'd rather have that than, say, Breitbart and the Drudge Report, to say nothing of tweets from Macedonian teenagers. So I think there are ways in which CNN can be improved, but I think it's dangerous to say, well, it's got flaws, let's just burn it down and hope something will be better. How confident am I? The reason I resist calling myself an optimist is that to declare that things will automatically get better is as irrational as to declare that things will automatically get worse. I think that the best we could do is identify, based on data and evidence, what seems to have worked, to try to advocate those things which have a good chance of working, and then the future will answer the question. I think we do have to address some of the systematic pathologies of the media and other institutions, and that itself is exactly what I would identify as an Enlightenment ideal, namely using reason to try to solve problems for human betterment.
Ladies and gentlemen, the book is Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. Give it up for my colleague, my friend, Dr. Stephen Pinker. It's great.
And thank you to, very special thanks to Dr. Pinker and Dr. Gates for your candor and your conversation this evening. And thank you to all of you for sharing this evening with us. We hope you can continue to join in Cleveland Book Week. If you didn't snag your ticket for tomorrow evening's sold-out Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards at Playhouse Square, you can catch a live stream of the ceremony on ideastream.com. And to close, we invite you to join Dr. Pinker in the lobby to sign books. If you didn't bring a copy of your book, we will have copies available just outside the door and to the right. So thank you again for joining us here at the museum, and happy Cleveland Book Week.